Good to see each of you this morning. We're going to be studying from Luke chapter 15. You've probably heard numerous sermons on the prodigal son before, so this will be another one you get to hear, but it's such a good story, a lot of good lessons, and if I only got to preach on things you've never heard of, that would really cut into the things I could talk about. But Luke chapter 15 is such a great chapter for so many reasons, but we're going to talk about this particular parable with the prodigal son. Prodigal, of course, means wasteful living. That's why he's called that, because he lived a reckless life for a while. Reckless living. He wasn't careful about what he was doing. He wasn't careful about his morals. He is just seeking to gratify himself, seeking after lusts and pleasures and whatnot. The prodigal son is seen in many ways in our own day and time. The whole just do as you please, do what I want to do what makes me happy sort of thing is all this. In Jesus' story, there's a lot of lessons there, but these are hard lessons to learn, and lessons that through experience will help us to be better, and through mistakes that people make, they help us to be better and put things into proper perspective. You know, we don't want to just only learn because we make mistakes, although we want to learn from those too, but we want to learn from other people's mistakes as well. And so what lessons can we learn from the prodigal son, or what lessons did the prodigal son learn, is what we're going to talk about this morning. First of all, he learned that riotous living is a waste. It's a waste. And it wasn't what he thought it was going to be. Some translations use the word wasted. Some say squandered his estate with loose living. The ESV talks about squandering his estate with reckless living. And so that's, of course, a pretty full description as you think about what is taking place there. He leaves his family. He leaves what was the familiar, which would have included leaving the rules of the family. And of course, we find out that, or he finds out, it's not what he thought it was going to be. It's not as grand as he had hoped for. I don't know how much time he put into thought about what he was going to do, where he was going to go, what all was going to take place. It didn't pan out that way for him. Certainly, he had a good time for a while, but he found out you can't just live on fun. You can't just go out and do what you want to do and just do that indefinitely. He would have had friends, no doubt, for a while, but only for a while. And they don't last. They're likely just willing to use him as long as they are getting something out of it, as he would have catered to their own whims as well. Certainly for us, you know, if you want to be used by people, there will be people that will use you and do that for you, but don't expect them to be there whenever things go bad or things don't work out for you in one way or another, or you get into trouble and have a need. Well, you're not going to find those people there at that time. Sometimes we might think that, well, at least he went to a faraway country before he did all of this stuff. I guess maybe there's something to be said about that. His family name, family reputation, family honor, things like that. But, you know, as you read the story, that's not really what he's concerned about. He's not really concerned about sparing his dad reputation or anything like that at all. What he's really concerned about is he doesn't want any of that control. He doesn't want any of that accountability. Certainly he doesn't want mom and dad coming by and checking on how are things. He's going to go off and he's going to do whatever it is he wants to do, and doesn't want to have any kind of accountability. Maybe you've seen this yourself when you went to college or something. People going to school, they've sometimes never been away from home, never been out on their own at any point at all, and sometimes people just go crazy with that kind of newfound freedom, and it's a scary thing to think about. what people sometimes do in those kinds of situations. But the prodigal son, he's not thinking about the hurt of his family or what's going to happen there. He's only thinking of himself. He's only thinking about taking what he wants to do, what he views as rightly his, and going to some distant place and doing whatever he wants to do and not having to answer for any of that. His heart is not at home. He's not concerned about morality or integrity or any sort of self-respect. But what we see in the story is it wasn't worth it. That riotous living was a waste. He didn't realize that from the get-go, but it wasn't worth it. He thought it was going to be worth it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have done this to begin with, but it wasn't worth it. And it reminds me of what Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4, when he talks about, this is my paraphrase version, you've spent enough time doing the will of the Gentiles. You've spent enough time living that way outside of the Lord. That time has passed. You shouldn't be involved in that anymore. And he mentions there in 1 Peter chapter 4, sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousals, drinking parties, abominable idolatries. You spend enough time doing those things. It's time for you to have a different direction and goal. Because the people that Peter is talking to should have realized that this is not where it's all at. It's not in that kind of living that there's hope, that there's joy, that there's anything lasting. And just as the prodigal son learned that there's not anything in that wasteful living, so that's the way we have to learn as well. Hopefully, again, we learn from other people, but Peter makes the point there about, you've spent enough time doing those things. It's time to really live for the Lord. Secondly, he learns who really cares for him. He doesn't spend much time being concerned at first, I'm sure, about his father or his brother. He's too busy. I'm doing my own thing. I'm busy. I am, doing what's right for me. I'm selfishly having a good time and living for myself. And he's not concerned about other people, let alone his family. That's a pretty big parallel to what sin does, is it not? That's kind of the nature of sin. We're not thinking about God. We're not thinking about Christians. We're thinking about ourselves. The very nature of sin is something that separates. It drives a wedge between us and God. It drives a wedge between us and those who are trying to do what's right, and certainly God. It creates a wall of sorts between us and them, or us and God, and we forget who really cares for us, who really is concerned for us. And just as Isaiah wrote in Isaiah 59, when he says, it's not that the Lord's hand is so short or his ear is so dull, but what is it? He says, your iniquities have made a separation between you and your God. Your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. That's what sin does. It's a wedge, it's a driver, it separates, it creates a division. And we don't need that to be there. We need to understand who it is that really loves us, who it is that really cares for us. The prodigal son wasn't thinking about that for quite a while, but he certainly goes on to learn about that. And so, what is our priorities going to be? Are we going to live a lie? Are we going to live a life of division between us and God, and us and godly people? How are we going to conduct ourselves? Many people, they sear their conscience. They just do what they want to do. They have to distance themselves from parents and people who they used to have respect for at one time, so that they can go off and do their own thing. But as the prodigal son has to learn, those are not the people that are going to care for you. Those aren't the people that really care about you. So the prodigal son, when his money is gone, his friends are not there to pick him up. They're a non-issue, aren't they? They're not there when he's having trouble, when he finds himself in the pig pen. They're not there to help him out with money or financing or anything. Where were they when he was in need? They weren't there at all. Who was his friend at that time? He's alone. He's alone. But you know what? He knows a guy. I know a guy. He knows a guy who will take him back in. He knows somebody that would be much better than whatever it is that he's been going through. He knows somebody that is really going to be a friend when he desperately needs one, who really does care about him and would do something about this situation. And that's pretty encouraging to think about, even though it takes him down this horrible path for him to realize it. But that makes you think about the friends that we have and the people that we associate with and who we are around. If we're just with people that have something to gain out of it and don't really give anything to that, that's not a good situation to be in. And the prodigal son really needed a friend, really needed a true friend that would be there for him. And he finds out he can count on his father. He can count on his father at least to treat him like a servant, at least to feed him as one of his servants. He knows that much, at least, about his father and his love, that he could at least have some food as his servants had food and some to spare. What we also find, though, is that he greatly underestimates his father's love, doesn't he? Really underestimates the kind of love and care and concern that his father has. But it's a great thing for us to think about who really cares for him. It's not all these people he's been hanging out with here lately. It's his father, the one he left so that he could do all of these other things. Number 3, riotous living has some hidden costs. There are some things that he didn't really count on. I think it's pretty fair to say that he didn't see this coming whenever he set out on this journey. Very few people would set out on a course knowing that they're going to have these kinds of problems. And yet, often people do set out on this kind of a course, but they don't count on the hidden costs. They just think about, I get to do my own thing. I get to be my own person. I can do whatever I want. I don't answer to anybody. No accountability. And that's what I want. I don't want to have to be concerned with any of that. But they're not thinking about, well, what does that mean? How is that going to affect me? How many people live a life of sin and are thinking, well, I'm probably going to get pregnant, or I'm probably going to have some sort of complication, disease, problems that come up from living that kind of a life. People think, it's not going to happen to me. That's not going to be me. I'm not going to be one of those statistics. That happens to other people. Let alone thinking about the toll on oneself, mentally, physically, how we then view our life on a whole, the inability to really come to grips with any kind of normalcy in our life, not having any kind of self-respect because we've just gone out of the way to go the opposite direction. People don't think about that whenever they set out to do these kinds of things, but there's hidden costs, because lots of times we just think, oh, I'm going to do my own thing, not be controlled by anybody else. The proverb writer says it right when he says the way of the transgressor is hard in Proverbs 13 and verse 15. Because people don't often think about that. But there's hidden costs in thinking that somebody else owes me something, or that it's going to be different for me than it is so many other people. Certainly that was the case with the prodigal son. He didn't set out thinking, I'm going to go out and do my own thing. I know it's going to be just terrible and awful, and there's going to be all these problems, but I'm going to go anyway. That's not what he was thinking at all. He was thinking of all these other things about the good and the freedom, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And yet we see that that's not the way it worked out. He finds himself in a situation where only a pig farmer is going to give him a job, And the pay doesn't seem to be very good, as he's hoping to get at least the food that the pigs eat. I mean, I don't know what that looks like exactly, but that's not a pretty picture when you're thinking about a young Jewish boy, and he's wishing for the pig slop and hoping for some of that. And that's a pretty sorry situation, the ultimate humiliation for a Jew. And yet we see some things from all of that that's pretty serious. People don't think about that when they're thinking about themselves. Usually, that's not the picture that we have of going out on our own and doing what we want to do. Is I'm going to be in the pig pen, and yet if we're not careful, that can be us, because there's hidden costs. There's things that we don't figure into the scheme of things, because for some reason we always think it's all going to turn out for the best for me, and often it doesn't if we're not living the correct way. Mistakes can be corrected. This is the last point. Mistakes can be corrected if we wake up soon enough, if we come to a realization of what's at stake. How much time do we have to do that? How much time do we have to make corrections and to come back and correct those mistakes? I don't know. You don't know. If we can get back in time, maybe it'll be okay. If we can come back to God before it's too late, maybe it'll be all right. But we don't know how much time we have, do we? One of the great things, of course, about the story of the prodigal son is when it says he came to his senses. He came to his senses. And then he doesn't just say, well, I'm glad that happened, and go back to the pig pen. That would be a pretty bad story, wouldn't it? But he came to his senses, and how encouraging that is to think about, that he was able to think back favorably on his upbringing, favorably on what he had been through as a child, saw things from a whole different perspective now. Now all of a sudden his harsh, unreasonable father that had all of these things going that he didn't like, he seemed like maybe he's a pretty good guy now, right? Maybe he wasn't as crazy as I thought he was. Because after all, when it came down to it, he's really the only guy I have. He's the only friend that I have that I can count on. Everybody else is gone. He comes to his senses, and he recognized his previous actions as being sinful. I think that's such a big point in this story. He doesn't say, I've done a couple things that I shouldn't have done, maybe that were not quite the right path that I should have taken. He doesn't go that route and try to dismiss his actions as just being a little bit unwise. He calls it like it is. When he says there in verse 18, I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. That's pretty encouraging to think about. He not only comes to his senses, but he recognized his actions as being sinful. He doesn't try to gloss it over or make it be something less than that. He calls it what it is. They were sinful. I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. And that's such a big key for ourselves as well as the rest of the world, is that kind of humility that it takes in order to see things for what they are. When you do something wrong, it's sin. When I do something wrong, it's just not as great of a thing, but surely it's not as bad as what you do, right? It's easy to dismiss the things that we do as something less than what we see in other people. But that's not what he does here. He calls it sinful for what it is. And then also, not only does he come to his senses and recognize his past as being mistakes and sinful, but then he actually does something about that. And as he says there in verse 18, I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men. What does he do next in verse 20? He gets up, he goes to his father. While his father's afar off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And then look what he says to his father. Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. He says to his father exactly what he had determined previously to say. He doesn't dismiss it or say, oh, well, Dad's in a better mood than what I thought. I'll just kind of gloss it over. No, he came to his senses. He realizes what his actions were all about, and he goes and he says the very thing he had determined beforehand to do. And so that shows me as well that not only is he sincere in this, but that humility is true, that he does come to his senses. He did recognize it for what it is. And when it comes down to it, he confronts it in that very way. He doesn't try to make himself better than what he is, but really confesses what his situation really is. And that's encouraging to think about how far he comes, of course, in a bad way, but also then in a good way whenever he realizes his situation, doesn't try to dismiss it, but fesses up to it and goes to make things right. The Father, as we just read, is there. He is looking for his Son. He's filled with love and compassion, and he wants to take him back immediately. Of course, we know the story. It's a great story about that kind of love and compassion that he has, and the party that he calls, and all the good things that are coming from that. But that's really the story for us as well, isn't it? That's the story of God. When we get off the path, when we don't do what we're supposed to do, God is there. He's watching. He wants us to come back. He's not sitting at home, figuratively, of course, thinking, I don't want him back. I don't want him to come back. He made his bed. He's got to sleep in it, and that's just the way it's going to be. He's looking for us to come back, and he has confidence in us that we will. And that's something for us to think about as well. And it's so encouraging to think about that God is that way, full of love and compassion, wanting us to return. And of course, we can come back and return. And we can wake up from whatever we were in before, come to our senses, and get back right with the Lord and do the things that we're supposed to do. Romans chapter 13 and verse 11, Paul says there that it's time to wake up from being asleep. Our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. That's an interesting thing to think about. It's time to wake up, time to get going. We're a day closer today to eternity and our home in heaven than we were yesterday. It's closer today than it's ever been. It's time to get going, time to wake up, time to put things first and do what we're supposed to do. We can certainly fall asleep spiritually. We can be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. That's why, as the Hebrew writer talks about in Hebrews chapter 3, about as long as it's called today, to encourage one another, lest you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. We've got to do what we're supposed to do. We can be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin, but we're not to let that happen. Don't let that be you. We do have time to make a correction to the mistakes that we have made if we will do those things, because he wants us to be successful, wants us to come back to him and to reap that reward. And what an encouragement that should be for all of us. And it's so encouraging to think about this prodigal son coming to his senses. Some people never do. Some people never scrape up the humility to admit they're wrong and to go back. Some people just live that way and indefinitely. But we find the prodigal son doesn't do that. And what a waste that is if we just turn away from the Father and never come back. How sad that is. Such a lifetime influence all wasted. It's easy to become disillusioned by the common everyday things, to be not so excited about the daily work, the daily doing whatever we're supposed to do day in and day out. But it's the wise person that learns from the mistakes of others to see who really cares for them, who really has their best interests in mind, and certainly to learn from the mistakes that other people have made. Jesus' story is just that. It helps us to appreciate what we have, who we are, how much God loves us, how concerned he really is about us, so that we don't have to go down that road. We don't have to go down that path and find ourselves hopeless and friendless and in a place we didn't expect. He makes it possible for us to avoid all of those things, to see how he really does care for us and really want what is best for us. You have the opportunity this morning, if your life is not right, to change that. You are in full control of that. I can't determine that. You can't determine that for anybody else. We can just determine it about ourselves. But if we have not been living the right kind of life, know that God wants you to come back. He wants you to be right in his sight. He's there with open arms, with a heart of love and compassion and forgiveness, wanting you to return, wanting to welcome you in, wanting to kill that fatted calf and to celebrate because it's such a great thing. And that's the way that he views us and desires us to be. But we have to have the humility about us to admit that we've been wrong and to turn back and turn back to him. But you have the opportunity this morning to do that. If your life is not right with the Lord because you're not a Christian, you have the opportunity to change that, to put him on in baptism, to be a part of his family, to look forward to that inheritance, that eternal life. Today we're closer than we've ever been before to eternity. And if we can help you this morning in doing that, we'd like to assist you. If you let it be known by coming forward, together we stand and sing.
God is calling the prodigal.